Welcome to Module 6, Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications of Artificial Intelligence. In earlier work with artificial intelligence, it is easy to focus on models, data, accuracy, and technical performance, because those are the parts of the field that often feel most visible. But once an artificial intelligence system moves into an organization, a classroom, a hospital, a business process, or a public service, the question changes. We're no longer asking only whether the system works. We're also asking who it affects, who is responsible for its decisions, how its data was collected, what harms could emerge, and whether the people affected have meaningful protection and recourse. That is why this module is organized around the ethical, legal, and social implications of artificial intelligence, rather than around a single technical method. Artificial intelligence is not neutral simply because it is mathematical, and it's not automatically responsible simply because it produces useful outputs. Every system reflects decisions made by people, including what problem is worth solving, what data is relevant, what outcomes are optimized, what risks are tolerated, and who gets to define success. When those decisions are hidden inside automated processes, the technology can appear objective even when it is reproducing human assumptions, institutional priorities, or unequal conditions already present in society. As we move through this module, we'll begin with the ethical challenges that follow artificial intelligence into practical use. These include responsibility, human oversight, harmful outcomes, and the danger of relying too heavily on automated systems. Responsibility matters because an artificial intelligence system does not exist by itself. It is designed, trained, deployed, monitored, purchased, governed, and used by people and institutions. When a system produces a harmful recommendation or an unfair decision, it is not enough to say that the algorithm made the choice. A responsible organization has to ask how the system was built, what safeguards were in place, whether humans understood its limits, and whether the people affected had a way to challenge the outcome. We'll then examine bias and fairness, which connect technical design to social reality. Bias can enter through data, but it can also enter through flawed assumptions about what should be measured, what counts as a good prediction, and which groups are represented in the information used to train or evaluate the system. Even when no one intends discrimination, an artificial intelligence system can still produce discriminatory outcomes if the data reflects past inequalities, or if the model is optimized without attention to how errors are distributed across populations. Fairness, then, is not simply a moral slogan. It is a practical requirement for evaluating whether artificial intelligence systems are trustworthy across industries and communities. Privacy and data governance form another major part of this module because artificial intelligence depends heavily on large-scale data collection and analysis. The more powerful these systems become, the more important it is to ask where the data came from, whether individuals understood how it would be used, how long it will be stored, who has access to it, and what protections exist against misuse. Data governance gives structure to these questions by connecting collection, storage, use, and protection into a broader framework of accountability. Without that framework, organizations may treat data as raw material for innovation, while overlooking the rights, expectations, and vulnerabilities of the people behind the data. We'll also consider regulation and public policy, because responsible artificial intelligence cannot depend only on the good intentions of developers or companies. Governments, institutions, and industry groups are trying to define rules that support innovation while reducing foreseeable harm. Too little oversight can allow harmful systems to spread before the risks are understood. But poorly designed regulation can also slow beneficial uses or create compliance rituals that do not actually protect people. The goal is not to reject artificial intelligence, but to develop policies that make its development and deployment more transparent, accountable, and aligned with public values. Finally, this module asks us to look at artificial intelligence as a social force. Widespread adoption affects labor, inequality, public trust, and the institutions people depend on in everyday life. It can support better decisions and still undermine trust if people experience it as opaque, unchallengeable, or imposed without explanation. So as we begin this module, I want us to hold two ideas together. Artificial intelligence can create real benefits, but responsible use requires ethical judgment, legal awareness, sound governance, and careful attention to human consequences. Artificial intelligence creates value because it can recognize patterns, automate complex tasks, and support decisions at a speed and scale that human beings often cannot match. That is why organizations use AI to improve efficiency, expand innovation, and redesign work. But those benefits also create ethical responsibility, because a system that acts quickly, broadly, and invisibly can affect people before anyone has fully understood the consequences. When we talk about ethical challenges in artificial intelligence, we are not treating ethics as separate from the technology. We are asking how technical choices become human consequences once the system is placed into real life. One of the first challenges is responsibility. An AI system may generate a recommendation, rank applicants, flag a transaction, guide a medical decision, or influence what information someone sees online. But the system itself is not morally accountable in the way a person or institution is accountable. Responsibility belongs to the people who design, train, purchase, deploy, approve, and manage the system. Harm can easily be displaced onto the technology, as if the organization can say, the algorithm decided, and therefore no one is answerable. A responsible approach refuses that excuse. It asks who selected the data, who defined the objective, who tested the model, who approved its use, who monitors its effects, and who responds when damage occurs. Human oversight is closely connected to responsibility, but it's not as simple as placing a person somewhere near the technology. Meaningful oversight requires that humans understand the purpose of the system, the limits of its output, and the conditions under which they should intervene. If a person supervises an AI system but does not understand how it reaches conclusions, lacks authority to override it, or is pressured to accept its recommendations automatically, then oversight becomes symbolic rather than real. The organization may claim that a human is in the loop, while the actual decision process is still driven by automation. Ethical AI requires oversight that is informed, empowered, and continuous, not just a final human signature. Another major concern is harmful outcomes. Harm can take many forms, and it's not always dramatic or immediately visible. A flawed AI system might deny someone an opportunity, increase surveillance, produce misleading information, reinforce a stereotype, expose private data, or make an unequal process harder to challenge. The ethical issue is not only whether harm was intentional. Many harmful outcomes emerge from ordinary design decisions, such as choosing the wrong performance metric, training on incomplete data, deploying a tool outside the context where it was tested, or failing to monitor how people experience the system. This is why ethical evaluation has to look beyond accuracy alone. A system can be statistically impressive and still be socially damaging if its errors fall unfairly, its consequences are severe, or users trust it too much. Reliance on automated systems adds another layer of risk. As AI becomes more convenient, people and organizations may begin to defer to it even when judgment, context, and professional responsibility are still necessary. Repeated reliance can weaken human attention. If people assume the machine is probably right, they may stop asking difficult questions, stop checking edge cases, or stop noticing when the system is operating outside its proper boundaries. Over time, automation can shift not only decisions, but habits of thinking. The danger is not simply that AI will make one wrong recommendation. The danger is that organizations may redesign processes so humans become passive reviewers of machine outputs rather than active decision makers. These ethical challenges remind us that artificial intelligence systems reflect human choices at every stage. Design choices shape what the system is supposed to do. Deployment choices determine where it will be used, by whom, and under what conditions. Governance choices determine who is accountable, how risks are reviewed, how performance is monitored, and how effective people can seek correction. None of these choices disappears because a model is complex or because its output is produced by computation. In fact, complexity increases the need for governance because the effects may be harder to see and explain. So when we evaluate the ethics of artificial intelligence, we should avoid two extremes. We should not treat AI as inherently harmful, because these systems can improve services, reduce waste, support discovery, and help people make better decisions. But we also should not treat efficiency and innovation as automatic moral justification. The central question is whether AI is being developed and used in a way that preserves accountability, protects people from harm, and keeps human judgment meaningfully involved where it matters most. Bias and fairness are among the most important issues in AI because they show that technical systems can reproduce social problems even when no one explicitly programs them to discriminate. When an AI system makes predictions, classifications, rankings, or recommendations, it learns from patterns in data and from the assumptions built into its design. That means the system does not begin from a neutral view of the world. It begins from the information it has been given, the categories people have chosen, the outcomes people have decided to measure, and the social conditions that produce the data in the first place. So, when we analyze bias in AI, we are really asking how human history, institutional practice, and technical design become embedded in automated decision making. A common source of bias is bias data, but that phrase needs more precision than it often receives. Data may be biased because some groups are underrepresented, because the records were collected unevenly, because labels reflect human judgment, or because past decisions were already unfair before the AI system ever entered the process. If an organization trains a model on historical hiring, lending, admissions, policing, or medical data, the model may learn patterns that reflect previous inequality rather than genuine merit, risk, need, or ability. The model may appear objective because it calculates probabilities, but those probabilities are built from a record of human decisions. If that record contains unequal treatment, the system can learn to repeat that treatment at scale. Bias can also emerge from flawed assumptions, and this is sometimes harder to recognize than biased data. Designers have to decide what problem the system is solving, what variables matter, what outcome counts as success, and which errors are acceptable. Those choices may seem technical, but they contain value judgments. If a system is designed only to maximize efficiency, it may ignore whether the benefits and burdens of that efficiency are distributed fairly. If a model treats a convenient measurement as if it were the true outcome of interest, it may optimize for the wrong thing. Bias is not only a problem of bad data. It can arise when the whole framing of the problem is too narrow, too detached from context, or too focused on what is easy to measure. Unequal social conditions create another important pathway for bias, because AI systems often operate in societies where people do not begin with equal access, equal opportunity, equal documentation, or equal institutional treatment. A model trained on real-world data will often capture those inequalities because the data reflects the world as it has been, not the world as it should be. If we simply ask the model to predict based on historical patterns, we may reinforce the very conditions that responsible organizations should be trying to improve. A system can therefore be accurate in a narrow statistical sense, while still being unfair in a broader social sense. Fairness requires us to examine who benefits from an AI system and who bears the risk of its mistakes. It is not enough to report one overall accuracy score and assume the system works equally well for everyone. A model may perform well on average while producing higher error rates for particular groups, especially if those groups were poorly represented in the training data or affected differently by the variables used in the system. In real settings, those differences matter because a false rejection, a false accusation, a misdiagnosis, or a misleading risk score can carry serious consequences. Fairness therefore requires looking at outcomes across groups, contexts, and consequences, not only at aggregate performance. This is why understanding bias is essential for evaluating AI risks across industries. In healthcare, biased systems can contribute to unequal treatment or missed care, while in finance they can affect access to credit, insurance, or economic opportunity. In employment, they can shape who is screened in, who is screened out, and who is considered promising before a human ever reviews the full picture. In education, public administration, and criminal justice, automated assessments may influence placement, benefits, surveillance, or liberty. Across these areas, fairness is not a secondary concern. It is part of whether the system is safe, legitimate, and worthy of trust. A responsible approach to bias does not assume that perfect fairness is easy or that one metric will solve every problem. Different definitions of fairness can sometimes conflict, so organizations must be clear about which risks they are prioritizing and why. That means fairness requires technical testing, but also human judgment, stakeholder input, transparency, and ongoing monitoring after deployment. Bias is not a defect that can always be removed once and forgotten. It is a risk that has to be managed throughout the life of the system. AI deployment depends on data, and that dependence makes privacy and governance central to responsible use. Many AI systems do not work with a small, simple set of facts. They often rely on a large-scale data collection, repeated analysis, pattern detection, and information from many sources. That scale gives AI much of its power because the system can identify relationships difficult for people to see manually. But the same scale creates risk because personal, behavioral, financial, educational, medical, workplace, and location data can reveal far more about people than they may realize when data is collected. Privacy is therefore not only about whether a person's name appears in a database, it's about whether individuals have meaningful control over information that can describe, predict, classify, or influence them. Even data that seems harmless in isolation can become sensitive when it's combined with other data. A shopping pattern, a device signal, a search history, a classroom interaction, or a workplace metric may not appear private by itself. But when AI systems connect signals together, they can create profiles of behavior, preference, risk, productivity, health, or vulnerability. Privacy concerns become more serious as AI systems grow more capable and integrated into operations. Responsible data governance begins with data collection because organizations must ask what information they actually need and whether collecting it is justified. Collecting more data than necessary may feel useful because it creates possibilities for future analysis, but it also increases exposure. and responsibility. A responsible organization should be clear about why data is being collected, what purpose it will serve, and whether individuals have been informed in a way they can understand. Consent should not be treated as a box checked through vague language or hidden terms. In an AI context, meaningful consent requires attention to how data may be reused, combined, analyzed, or applied beyond the original interaction. Data storage raises governance questions because collecting data is only the beginning of responsibility. Once information is stored, the organization has to decide how long it will keep the data, where it will be stored, who can access it, and what safeguards will protect it from misuse or breach. Poor storage practices can turn an AI project into a long-term security liability. The more sensitive the data, the more serious the obligation to limit access, protect the systems that hold it, and remove information that no longer serves a legitimate purpose. Governance requires retention policies, access controls, audit trails, and accountability for how stored data is managed. Data use is equally important because ethical problems often emerge after collection and storage when information is applied in new contexts. A data set gathered for one purpose may be tempting to use for another purpose, especially when AI tools make analysis easier. But repurposing data can violate expectations, create unfair consequences, or expose people to decisions they never anticipated. Information collected to provide a service may become problematic if it is later used to evaluate risk, rank behavior, target messages, or make access decisions without transparency. Responsible governance requires purpose limitation, careful review of secondary uses, and a willingness to say no when a proposed use exceeds what is fair, necessary, or appropriate. Data protection brings these concerns together because privacy is weakened when organizations treat protection as only a technical security issue. Security matters, but protection also includes minimizing unnecessary data, de-identifying information when possible, monitoring access, testing for vulnerabilities, and preparing for incidents before they occur. AI systems can create new protection challenges because trained models may retain information, generate outputs that expose sensitive patterns, or depend on third-party platforms whose practices are not fully controlled by the organization using them. A responsible AI deployment must therefore consider the full data lifecycle, including model development, vendor relationships, user access, output handling, and monitoring. The broader point is that privacy and data governance are central to ethical AI deployment because AI systems transform data into decisions, predictions, and institutional actions. If data is collected carelessly, stored indefinitely, used beyond its original purpose, or protected weakly, then the system may create harm even if the model itself performs well. Responsible governance gives organizations a disciplined way to ask whether the data practices behind the AI system are legitimate, proportionate, secure, and accountable. Privacy is not an obstacle to innovation. It is one condition that allows people to trust AI systems enough for their benefits to be used responsibly. Regulation and public policy become important in AI because responsible development cannot depend only on individual judgment or voluntary promises. Artificial intelligence systems are now used in areas that affect employment, finance, education, healthcare, public administration, security, communication, and everyday access to services. When a technology reaches that level of social influence, the question is no longer only whether a company can build it or whether a model performs well in testing. The question becomes what standards should guide its use, what harms must be prevented, and what obligations organizations should have before these systems are placed in front of people. Governments and institutions are developing AI policies because the risks are not isolated to one organization. A poorly governed system can affect workers, consumers, patients, students, citizens, and communities that may have little ability to inspect or challenge it. Public policy creates a shared framework for accountability, so responsible behavior is not left entirely to market pressure or public relations. This does not mean every AI system should be regulated in the same way. A tool that organizes meeting notes does not create the same level of risk as a system used to approve loans, evaluate job applicants, recommend medical treatment, or support criminal justice decisions. Responsible policy has to recognize differences in context, scale, and consequence. One common regulatory approach is risk-based governance. In this approach, the level of oversight depends on the potential impact of the AI system. Low-risk uses may require basic transparency and good data practices, while higher-risk systems may require stronger testing, documentation, human oversight, auditability, and procedures for appeal or correction. This makes sense because regulation should not treat all automation as equally dangerous, but it also should not ignore systems simply because they are technically impressive or commercially useful. Risk-based governance asks organizations to identify foreseeable harms before deployment, not after people have already been affected. Another policy goal is transparency. Transparency does not mean every person must understand every mathematical detail of a model. Instead, it means organizations should be able to explain when AI is being used, what role it plays in a decision, what data or logic influences the outcome, and what limits the system has. People affected by AI should not be placed inside an invisible process where they cannot tell whether a human made the decision, whether automation shaped the result, or whether there is any way to contest an error. Transparency supports trust, but it also supports accountability, because unclear systems make it easier to avoid responsibility. Regulation also focuses on documentation and governance inside organizations. Responsible AI requires records of how data was collected, how models were trained, what testing was performed, what risks were identified, and how performance is monitored after deployment. These records matter because AI systems can change over time as data shifts, user behavior changes, or the system is applied in new contexts. A model that appears acceptable in one setting may become unreliable or unfair in another. Policy can require organizations to maintain evidence that their systems were evaluated carefully rather than deployed casually because they promised efficiency or cost savings. At the same time, regulatory approaches must encourage innovation. AI can improve services, accelerate research, support accessibility, detect fraud, reduce administrative burdens, and help organizations make better use of information. A policy environment that treats every AI use as suspicious may discourage beneficial development or create barriers that only large organizations can afford to manage. Responsible regulation should create guardrails rather than simply block progress. The aim is to make innovation more trustworthy by reducing avoidable harm, clarifying expectations, and helping organizations understand what responsible deployment requires. Public policy also has to account for AI systems that operate across organizations, vendors, sectors, and jurisdictions. That makes clear standards more necessary. The larger point is that AI governance is not anti-technology. It's a way of making powerful technology compatible with institutional responsibility. Good policy does not remove the need for ethical judgment, and ethical intentions do not remove the need for policy. They work together. Developers, managers, educators, government officials, and business leaders all need frameworks that help them ask the right questions before harm occurs. Responsible AI development means building systems that can be justified not only by their performance, but also by their protections, oversight, and public values that shape how they are used. Widespread AI adoption matters because artificial intelligence is becoming part of the infrastructure of everyday life. AI can shape how people search for information, apply for jobs, receive services, interact with government, communicate with businesses, learn in school, and make decisions under uncertainty. When a technology becomes that deeply embedded, its impact is not limited to technical performance or organizational productivity. It begins to influence social relationships, economic opportunity, institutional trust, and the ways people understand their own agency in a world increasingly mediated by automated systems. One major societal implication is inequality. AI can create new opportunities by expanding access to services, improving decision support, and reducing the cost of tasks that once required specialized expertise. But those benefits may not be distributed evenly. Organizations with more money, better data, and stronger infrastructure may gain advantages that smaller organizations, under-resourced communities, or vulnerable populations cannot easily match. At the same time, people who are already disadvantaged may be more exposed to poorly tested systems, limited transparency, or automated decisions that are difficult to challenge. The question is who receives that value, who is left behind, and who absorbs the risk when systems fail. Labor is another major area of social impact. AI can automate routine tasks, assist professionals, generate content, analyze documents, support customer service, and accelerate many forms of knowledge work. In some cases, this can make workers more productive and free them from repetitive work. In other cases, it can reduce demand for certain roles, increase surveillance of workers, intensify performance expectations, or shift power toward employers who control the tools and the data. Responsible analysis of AI in labor has to move beyond that simple question of whether jobs will disappear. It has to ask how jobs will change, what new skills workers will need, who will have access to retraining, and whether productivity gains will be shared fairly. Public trust is affected by widespread AI adoption because people are more likely to accept systems they believe are understandable, accountable, and used for legitimate purposes. Trust weakens when decisions appear to be made by opaque processes people cannot question, especially in areas that affect education, healthcare, employment, credit, policing, or public benefits. Trust also weakens when AI systems produce misinformation, deep fakes, biased outcomes, or service loops that make people feel trapped inside automation. Trust is not created by claiming that AI is advanced. Trust is created through reliability, transparency, correction mechanisms, and respect for the people affected. Social institutions are changed by AI because institutions depend on shared expectations about responsibility, expertise, evidence, and human judgment. In education, AI raises questions about learning, authorship, assessment, and academic integrity. In government, it raises questions about due process, surveillance, efficiency, and public accountability. In business, it raises questions about customer treatment, competition, liability, and the design of work. In communication, it raises questions about authenticity and the ability of the public to distinguish reliable information from synthetic or misleading content. Each institution faces different risks, but the deeper issue is similar. AI forces institutions to clarify what human values they are trying to preserve while adopting powerful automated tools. The impact of AI on everyday life can be subtle because people may interact with systems without realizing how much automation is shaping their choices. Recommendation systems influence what people watch, read, buy, believe, and discuss. Predictive systems may affect prices, access, eligibility, or attention. generative systems can change how people write, learn, create, and communicate. None of these effects is automatically bad, but they require reflection because convenience can gradually become dependency. If people rely on AI systems without understanding their limits, they may lose some ability to evaluate information independently or recognize when automation is serving someone else's interests. Responsible AI therefore requires balance. The goal is not to reject technological progress or deny the genuine benefits AI can bring to business, government, education, healthcare, and daily life. The goal is to make sure those benefits are pursued with attention to social consequences. That means asking whether adoption increases or reduces inequality, whether it supports or weakens workers, whether it strengthens or damages public trust, and whether it helps institutions serve people more responsibly. AI should be evaluated by what kind of society its use helps create, not only by what it can automate.